Okay, so thanks a lot for having me here. I'm excited to be speaking to this audience. It's a different audience than I'm used to, and I thought really long and hard about what I should talk about today. And so I looked at the schedule, and I saw that it's all about NLP, so I said, okay, I'll talk about speech. And I also saw that so far you've covered linear methods. And so I'll start with linear methods, but also go into some nonlinear methods. Feel free to stop me at any time. I like being interrupted with questions. Don't let me go on if things are not clear. Okay, so this is a broad overview of a bunch of work that my group's been involved with over the last few years on the topic of multiview representation learning. I think the official title was for speech and language, but as I was making the slides, I realized it was really for speech and language, and so that's my new slide. And it's joint work with a bunch of current and former students and postdocs and collaborators whose names I could not all list here, but I give a bunch of references during the talk. Okay. So since this might be the first time that you all are looking at speech at this summer school, here's some speech. So this is a speech signal. We'll talk more about speech signals as we go on, but I just wanted to have a picture that we can refer to. And so there's a lot of things in common between natural language processing, which most of the summer school is about, and speech, and also some important differences. So I thought I would start by just kind of outlining those. Okay, so some differences between text and speech. So speech is continuous valued, or at least we model it as continuous valued, whereas text we think of as discrete. Right, words are drawn from some vocabulary, or characters, or and so on. Speech is also continuous in time. No one tells us where word boundaries are, or phoneme boundaries, sound boundaries. So when you look at a speech signal, you could probably tell that this is silence and this is silence, but what's going on in the middle, you really have no good way. No matter how much of an expert you are, there's really not a great way of telling where different speech sounds start and end. So that's a big difference between speech and text. And that means that there's different mathematical objects that we use to describe speech versus text. Okay, there's also a lot of things in common. Speech and NLP problems, at least in terms of math, look very, very similar. Many of the problems are identical. Many of the algorithms are the same. And a lot of researchers work on both. So hopefully, as I'm showing examples of applications, I'll give examples of a bunch of applications. You'll see commonalities between applications that you work on or that you've seen and ones that you might not work on, but that look quite related in terms of math. Okay. More on text versus speech. So text can be more formal or less formal. So if you think about news text or documentary text, it tends to be very formal. If you think about social media like Twitter, it might be very informal. And so you might see many variants of the same word or phrase. So here's some example Twitterese, lots of things that essentially mean the same thing, but written as many different variants. Here's another semantic concept and all of its many variants in all of their glory. Speech, on the other hand, has even more variants. Basically a continuum of variants dictated by pronunciation variants, variations between speakers, acoustic environments, mood, how drunk you are. I hear some people might be affected by that later tonight, in which case your speech might look different than it looks right now. So really, all of these signals could correspond to the same word or to different words, and it would be very, very hard to tell on the face of it. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into speech. So let's think about a very, very simple speech task, or what seems like a simple speech task. Classifying a single digit from a spoken waveform. So this is a 1-second speech waveform that happens to correspond to a digit from 0 to 9. Does anyone have an idea which digit it is? Okay, good. Uniform prior. Good. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what we're looking at. So what we're looking at here is a recording from a microphone. What that means is that it's a function of time, and the y-axis is instantaneous air pressure at that time instant. So instantaneous air pressure impinging on the microphone membrane as a function of time. Since it's a digital signal, it's been discretized in time. In this case, we're looking at 16,000 samples. So it was recorded with a sampling rate of 16 kilohertz. In this case, it's also discretized in magnitude to 16 bits per sample. So even though it's hard to tell, the y-axis is discretized to 16 bits. And so what we're really looking at here is a 16,000 dimensional vector of 16-bit numbers. Okay, so something like this. And we're supposed to look at this and determine what digit was spoken. Okay. So this is hard. So here's an even simpler task, determining which two of these are the same digit. Can anybody tell which two of these are the same digit? Okay, good. Still uniform. So if you've done any signal processing at all, then you're probably thinking, we should be looking at this in the frequency domain. Signal processing people like to look at frequencies. They don't like to look at time domain signals. So let's put this into the frequency domain. And that's usually what we do when we start with any kind of task on speech. So we take each of those waveforms, and we represent it as a spectrogram. So a spectrogram is basically an image where the time axis, the x-axis is time, and it's the same scale as the original signal. And the y-axis is now frequency. And the darkness at any given point in time is how much of that frequency we have at that point in time. And the way we get this is by applying a Fourier transform over short windows, something like 20 milliseconds at a time, stepping through the original signal, and plotting that Fourier transform as a vector, as a vertical vector. So the Fourier transform part is not super important, but you can think of this as just telling us how much of each frequency we have at each point in time in this signal. Okay, so now, which two digits are the same among these three? Good. Okay. Yeah, so the first and second are the same. It's not necessarily obvious, but there is much more similarity in terms of these horizontal frequency bands that define typically vowels as well as some consonants of speech, whereas here you see much less of the high frequency energy and this transition in frequency, which you don't see here. Here you see very constant frequencies across time. Okay, good. So those two are the same digit. Still telling which digit it is not trivial. And to show that, I thought I would plot a few different examples of the exact same digit. So these are the two we saw before. And these are a bunch of other examples of the same digit. This is the digit 8. It's pronounced in a few different ways. This is 8. This is 8. This is 8. This is 8 with some background noise. You get the idea. So it's very, very hard to just look at an image like this and tell which digit it was. And this is pretty much the simplest speech recognition task that we can think of. So how do speech recognizers normally do this? So we won't really be talking about full speech recognition, but I did want to mention kind of how they work. So a traditional speech recognizer, up until the last couple of years, looked something like this. It would take the acoustic waveform, compute some acoustic features like a spectrogram, and the output of this would be a matrix or a sequence of vectors that might be Fourier transform vectors like we've seen, or they might be something else. And then the task of the speech recognizer is to use everything that it knows to decode or search through the possible space of words or word sequences that could possibly correspond to the signal. And the resources that it uses are an acoustic model, so a model of what different sounds sound like, a lexicon or pronunciation model describing how words are pronounced in terms of basic speech sounds, and a language model that tells us the prior probability of word sequences in the language. And all of these are learned from data. And possibly also the acoustic feature extraction process might be learned from data. And in the end, we hope to get the recognized word string. So this is a traditional speech recognizer that has a bunch of different components. In the last couple of years, there's been kind of a shift to end-to-end models, just like there has been in NLP, where we still start by extracting some features, and then we basically have some sort of deep neural network that goes directly from those features to a word string. Okay. So in this talk, we're basically only going to be talking about this part. How we represent the acoustic waveform in terms of some type of useful features, or how we represent anything in terms of useful features. So far we've seen waveforms, we've seen spectrograms. This is a spectrogram that just happens to be using a different color map. Sometimes we do some further processing on this and get other kinds of features. So one standard type of feature is Mel-frequency Kepstrel coefficients, and those look like this, corresponding to this spectrogram. And so you might see either spectrograms or MFCCs later on in the talk. So I'll use the term features and representations interchangeably. So this talk is about learning representations, learning how to map from the input signal to a useful sort of feature vector for extracting information from the signal. Okay. All right, so let's go back to text, back to more familiar ground. So representations for text, again, for purposes of this talk, will mean vectors of useful features for doing some task. So here's an example of a task that I'm sure you're familiar with, classifying whether a review is positive or negative. So we could look at these two reviews. Here's the first one. This is the best mattress I've ever had. It has a perfect combination of firmness and support. I have never slept better. So that's probably a positive review. Here's another review for a mattress. I hate this mattress. I can't believe I bought it. It seemed good in the store, but when it was delivered, I noticed it had a strange smell and was already lumpy. This is not what a new mattress should feel like. I want to tear it up and dump it. Okay, probably negative. Okay, so how should we represent these text documents in a way that we can determine whether the reviews were positive or negative? So one thing we could try to do is write down a vector of useful seeming features or representation for this task. So one dimension of our feature vector might be how many words in this document come from the set of good words, like good, great, and best, and so on. How many come from the set of bad words, like bad, horrible, and worst, and so on. Maybe the total number of words. Maybe when we're very, very negative about something, we go into great detail. I don't know. And probably some other things. Features that we probably would not use is the number of words that start with T, the number of capital letters. But again, I could be wrong. Maybe we use lots of capital letters when we're feeling really negative about something. So it's kind of hard to tell what is a good representation. So maybe we can design an algorithm that can automatically learn what features we should be computing from the input. And so that's what we mean by representation learning. And typically when we set about learning a representation, we start with some very long vector of possibly useful features, everything that we can think of, and we'll call that x. And so that will be a vector of a very high dimensional vector of anything that might be useful. And then we'll try to learn a function, f of x, that maps x to a more useful, usually smaller representation. And in doing so, it should discard the noise or nuisance variables. So if the number of words that starts with T is irrelevant, or if the frequency, the amount of frequency at 4,000 hertz is irrelevant in a speech signal, f of x should know to discard that from the original signal. Okay. And so some representation learning algorithms you might have already seen are principal components analysis, linear discriminant analysis, deep autoencoders. How many people have seen PCA? Good, okay. That will come in handy later. Okay, and many, many others. So in this talk, we're going to be interested in how can we learn representations in the presence of multi-view training data. So what we mean by that is that our input vector, our long input vector x, which is, I'm going to change notation here slightly. Our original input vector is actually the concatenation of two vectors, x and y. X is dx dimensional, y is dy dimensional. And how did we get that split? It might not be super clear right now, but I'll give some examples later. Our feature vector should have some natural split into two subvectors. And our task is to find representations of each of these two subvectors, which we'll call views, that are predictive of the other or that are somehow common to the two views. And the intuition for why that's a good idea is if the noise or the nuisance parameters are independent between the two views, then the shared information should be signal, should be important information as opposed to noise or nuisance. Okay. And this little picture here represents a manifold or some nonlinear space in which the x view lies. We'll call that view 1, and some other nonlinear space in which the y view lies. And the color represents the actual informative dimension in the signal. And so a little bit of intuition for why multi-view representation learning might help is imagine if we added some noise to each of these nonlinear spaces. So imagine just adding some Gaussian noise, say spherical Gaussian noise to this signal. Then you might have a very hard time distinguishing points that are over here on this end of the manifold versus over here. Okay. On the other hand, the same, if you add noise to the other view, those sets of points remain far apart because that other view has a very, very different shape. And so the two views can help us disambiguate what's signal versus what's noise, because hopefully noise will affect the two views differently. Okay. Now, typically, when we talk about multi-view representation learning, we don't know what views will be available at test time, so we'll be learning representations for both of the views. And then at test time, either both of them, or if there's more than two, all of them, or only a subset might be available. Okay. All right, so let's be a little bit more concrete about what these views might be. So sometimes different views of data are just naturally occurring different measurement modalities. So for speech, normally we'd record it with a microphone and get a signal that looks like this. But for various reasons, we sometimes record speakers with different types of measurement modalities. So video, for example, would give us some visual signal of the speaker, and maybe we could use some lip reading to help us disambiguate sounds. Some people measure MRI of people as they're speaking. Muscle activations, ultrasonic signals, and my favorite, flesh points on the articulators. So we'll be using, I'll show some results using data that looks like this, where the speaker was instrumented so that different flesh points on their articulators could be tracked. And that serves as another view to help us learn speech representations. Okay, so that's for speech. For text, text also comes with multiple views sometimes. So text in different languages can be seen as multi-view data. Text with corresponding images. So if the text happens to be captions of some images, that could serve as multi-view representation of the semantic content of that text. Wikipedia documents are also associated with their link structure. So that tells us something about the semantics of the documents. And so all of these can serve as different views. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, so let's start talking about methods. So the first one, that's one of the oldest and most popular multiview learning techniques is canonical correlation analysis. It dates back to the 1930s. And this is how it works. So we're given a data set of n-paired vectors, x1, y1 through xn, yn. And these are samples of random vectors x and y being our two views. And the goal is to find direction vectors, vj, wj, for up to k of these direction vectors that maximize the correlation between projections along those vectors. So maximize the correlation between the projection of x along the vj's and the projection of y along the wj's, while being as minimally redundant as possible. So I can write that optimization problem like this. So vj, wj is an argmax of the correlation between these two projections, such that the correlation within each view between any pair of projections is 0. Okay. So why might that be helpful for anything? So here's some toy examples. So let's look at this data set of blue data and red data. Okay, these are drawn from two Gaussians, the blue Gaussian and the red Gaussian. They're two-dimensional, but there's really only one dimension of information here, whether we're in the blue or in the red. Everything else is noise. Okay, so if we wanted to cluster the data or classify between these classes or anything that where we wanted to get information out of this data, we might want to project onto the single most meaningful direction. Okay. So if we did that with PCA for this data set, could people point in the direction that that vector would go? Okay, I sort of gave it away, but that's okay. Okay, good. Yeah, so this is the top PCA projection direction. So if I project all of the data along this vector, and then I look at a histogram of those projections, those one-dimensional projections, they look like this, and the blue and the red classes are fairly nicely separated. Okay. If, on the other hand, I take this data set, which direction would the top PCA projection be? The same, yeah. So again, PCA is just looking for the maximum variance direction, so it would again find this direction, which is exactly the wrong dimension if we're looking to get the class or cluster information out of this data. So if we take the top PCA dimension and we project the data along that dimension, and then look at histograms of those projections, they're almost perfectly overlapping between the classes. Okay. So this is a case where PCA doesn't work, and we know why it doesn't work, because PCA is not scale invariant. So if we scale the data, we don't really change the information in the data, but we change the PCA dimension that we learn. Okay, so what if we had two-view data? Okay, so let's say, so now our data is four-dimensional, two dimensions per view. So this is now view 1. It's the same as this data set. And this is view 2. It might be a little hard to see, but view 2 has two slightly separated Gaussians. Okay. So now if we take the most correlated direction in these two data sets, so now we're ignoring variance within either of the data sets, but we're going to look at just which direction here is most correlated with which direction here. Now the only thing that's correlated between these two data sets is which Gaussian the data came from. Everything else is noise. So does anybody have an idea which direction now in view 1 would be the top most correlated dimension? Okay, there's a little more variance in the answers, but the highest dimension, I won't say it, but most people are voting for this direction. So the direction that basically connects the two means of the Gaussians. And that's right. And that's exactly what CCA would give you if you ask it for a single most correlated direction between the two views. In this view, it would give you this direction. This one is just a little bit harder to see because the Gaussians are so close together, but they're not completely overlapped. The means are separated. So if I were to project view 1 along the top dimension, it would look like this. It would nicely separate the clusters. If I project view 2, it looks like this. It separates the clusters as well as they could possibly be separated given the noise in that view. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So there's some theoretical results that sort of formalize this intuition that we've been talking about, that if there's some kind of cluster or class structure to the data, then CCA will find just the right dimensions that help to discriminate among the classes in the data, assuming that the views are uncorrelated given the class label. Okay. Okay. So that just gave some intuition for why multi-view learning might help if our data is nicely behaved in this sense. But CCA is only linear, and a lot of times the useful information resides in nonlinear projections of the data. So there have been a number of nonlinear extensions of CCA, and one that we've developed we call Deep CCA, and this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a nonlinear extension of CCA, where instead of learning linear projections of the two views, we're learning two neural networks that need not be the same. They'd happen to be the same in this figure. So the representation of each view is the output of its corresponding network, so the red output nodes of the networks. And all of the parameters are learned jointly to optimize the CCA loss. This is just another way of writing the CCA loss compactly in terms of the covariance of the data. And I know that you haven't covered neural networks here. I'm sure that some people have seen neural networks. For purposes of this talk, we'll just think of neural networks as being very, very flexible, nonlinear functions whose parameters we will learn. Okay. And we will not talk about the optimization much. Yes? Why do we have two different mappings, one for X and one for Y, rather than the same one? Okay. So why don't we just learn to map from one to the other? Right. So there's a few reasons. So we could do that, and that might be the appropriate thing to do for some application. It's often not what we want. So often we don't necessarily want to predict the other view as well as we possibly can, because it's often very, very difficult to predict one of the views from the other. And for any finite data set, we'll end up predicting, trying to predict random nuisance parameters that are not important. So what CCA basically does is it simultaneously learns to predict what is the most predictable aspects of the other view and how to predict them. Okay. Okay. I used to have a slide answering that question, and I took it out, and I realized I should have left it in. Okay. All right. More recently, we've been working with something that we call deep variational CCA. or VCCA. I also call it very not CCA because it's actually not optimizing the CCA loss, but it is a deep extension of a generative interpretation of CCA. So there's a very nice paper in 2005 giving a generative interpretation of CCA. And that interpretation is that we have some hidden variable z, which is generating both x and y. And a deep extension of that idea gives us deep variational CCA. And so how that works is, in deep variational CCA, we assume that there's some privileged view, which is the one that we really want to learn the representation for. If we want to learn representations for both views, then we do variational CCA twice. Okay, so let's say that our privileged view that we actually care about is x. So we'll learn a neural network to predict some latent representation that will be our learned features with a neural network. And then we have a pair of neural networks that tries to predict back both of the views, both x and y. If we also believe that x and y have some private information that's not shared, then we'll have another pair of networks that learns those private representations of the two views. Okay, so in the end, we end up with a shared representation and two private representations. And if you've never seen deep autoencoders, then this might look sort of weird and cumbersome. But this is basically a multi-view extension of deep variational autoencoders, which I'm sure you'll see in a couple of lectures if you haven't already. Yes? It is asymmetric, yes. So if you really want a representation of y, you need to do the whole thing over again. You can imagine a symmetric version of this, but it would not have the same interpretation as a deep extension of generative CCA. Okay. Yes?
So the question is, when you train the whole thing, you train like each of the neural networks separately, or you train them all together to predict the two views?
We train them all together. I didn't write down the loss. But we're basically training it to reconstruct x and y while keeping the distribution of z as close as possible in terms of KL divergence to some prior. So it's basically reconstruction loss with a regularizer. And all of the networks are trained jointly to optimize that same loss. Okay. All right. That's not necessarily enough detail to go home and implement this, I know. But it's just, it hopefully gives a flavor of what these different methods are doing. A final method, which has nothing to do with CCA, is multiview contrastive loss. And this is not one that we developed. It's been developed multiple times. I think the first application to NLP was by Herman and Blunsum. And this is the intuition for multiview contrastive loss is to treat the pairs of vectors as a form of supervision, as a form of labeling. It's basically telling us that these pairs go together and other pairs don't. So we'll learn a representation that brings the paired vectors closer together while keeping random other unpaired vectors farther apart by at least some margin. So this is what contrastive multiview loss looks like. We're learning one representation of x, and so we call that representation f, one representation of y that we call g, and then we want the distance between matched pairs, x plus and y plus, to be closer, to be lower than the distance between mismatched pairs, x plus and y minus, at least by some margin m. So this is, if you've seen hinge losses or looked at SVMs, this is just a large margin or a hinge type loss applied to the problem of classifying between matched and mismatched pairs. Okay, and this can be a very competitive alternative to CCA. It's sort of task dependent, which one might work better than another. So we typically play with both types of losses when we're working on applications with multi-view data. Okay. And there's also a whole host of other methods that I'm not going to talk about. So another nonlinear extension of CCA is kernel CCA. And I'm not talking about it simply because it doesn't tend to scale up very well to large data sets. And these days, we all like to use large data sets. Multiview autoencoders, multiview deep Boltzmann machines, and this is basically lots of other multiview deep network type learners. Okay. All right, so let's look at some data. So this is a toy example that's just slightly less toy than the one we looked at before. This is a synthetic data set that's based on the MNIST data set. So the MNIST data set is a set of black and white hand-drawn digits. And our synthetic version of it is a multi-view MNIST, where one view is random rotations of the original MNIST, and the other view is the original MNIST plus pixel noise. Okay. And so the reason we generated this data set is we wanted a multi-view data set that perfectly satisfied the assumptions of typical multi-view learning algorithms, namely that they have uncorrelated noise between the views. Okay, so we generated a synthetic data set that had uncorrelated noise. The rotation noise and the pixel noise is uncorrelated between the two views. And then we try to learn representations for these two views. Okay, and so what do these representations look like? So now we can visualize them. So these are a bunch of visualizations of different representations of just view one, which happens to be this random rotation view. Okay. These are two-dimensional representations using everybody's favorite two-dimensional visualization tool, TSNE, which if you haven't played with it before, you should definitely go out and play with it with any data set that you have that's higher than two-dimensional. So this is a two-dimensional TSNE representation of our inputs. Each color corresponds to data points from a different digit. And let's see, this is CCA. So you can kind of see how it tries to turn all of the classes into Gaussian blobs. These are multi-view autoencoders. This is one of the other deep learning methods that I haven't gone into. This is contrastive loss, deep CCA, and variational CCA. So it might not necessarily be obvious which is the best, but this bottom row should all look like it's separating the classes a lot better than the top row. And in practice, they all perform fairly well on tasks like digit classification. Okay, and so one nice thing specifically about variational CCA is that it allows us to separate between the shared dimensions and the private dimensions between the two views. So if we take the random rotation view, view one, and look at the shared dimensions only in one visualization and the private dimensions only in another visualization, we see sort of what we would hope to see. In the private dimensions, I'm not sure if you can see back there, but you can sort of tell, at least from the front, that what's going on is the two dimensions have to do with angle, right? Angular variation from this direction over here to that direction over here. Whereas the shared dimensions all have to do with digit identity. So in the private view, all of the digits are jumbled together, and only the angle is changing through different parts of the visualization, whereas here the different digits are nicely separated. Okay. All right, so on to some real experiments. Any questions before real data? Okay. So some speech recognition experiments. I'm more of a speech person, and so I'm mostly applying these techniques to speech data, but they're quite general techniques. So I'll talk briefly about other applications later on. So like I said, we'll be using this data that involves speakers having pellets attached to specific flesh points on their articulators, their tongue, their lips, their teeth. And then those pellets are all tracked inside this big machine, an X-ray microbeam machine that shoots tiny rays, microbeams of X-rays at the speaker's face. They should be small enough beams of X-rays to be safe, but should be able to track the locations of those pellets. And then this diagram is showing a side view of a speaker. So here's the nose, the lips, the chin, the teeth, the tongue. And then the green circles correspond to the pellets that we're tracking. So there's 8 of them, 4 along the tongue, 2 on the lips, and 2 on the teeth. And what we get from this data is the X and Y locations of those pellets as a function of time. Okay, so this, we believe, should be very, very informative about what the speaker is saying, because the way that we generate speech sounds is to form our articulators into specific positions for each different speech sound. So speech sounds that might be ambiguous acoustically might be disambiguated by looking at where the articulators actually are. And this is very, very special data. Obviously, we don't expect to ever be able to measure this at test time. We don't ever expect to have a Siri that says, please attach pellets to your articulators so that I can understand you better. But we do think that we might be able to use this kind of data to at least tell us what is a useful representation of the acoustics. And we didn't collect this data ourselves. It was collected at the University of Wisconsin, largely for scientific purposes. But it's been used in the intervening years for a lot of speech recognition research. Okay. And here's some results. Okay, so the task that we're doing here is phonetic recognition. So we take an utterance of speech, which is typically one whole sentence, and we're trying to transcribe the phonemes, the speech sounds, the individual vowels and consonants. And then we look at the phone error rate, which is the edit distance between the sequence that the recognizer produced and the ground truth sequence that the speaker actually uttered. And we measure that error rate in percent, and lower is better. This is a baseline recognizer, which just uses some standard acoustic features for speech recognition. This is what happens. So this baseline is not using the other view at all. This is what happens if we use CCA to learn a representation of the acoustics, then throw away the articulatory data and use the newly learned acoustic representation to do speech recognition. So that already does quite a bit better. Multiview deep autoencoders do similarly. Contrastive loss and the deep CCAs do much, much better. So if you look at the best performing model, it's almost half the error rate of the baseline, which is quite remarkable. So this is very, very nice, a very nice additional view that this particular data set provides us. Okay, so these experiments show that we can, in principle, learn a much, much better acoustic representation. However, the results that I showed you so far are only measured on this same data set. So same recording conditions, same acoustic noise, same linguistic material that all of the speakers were reading. We'd really like to be able to use the learned representations on some standard speech task, some standard data set that doesn't have any articulatory data. And so basically, you can think of this problem as a combination of representation learning and domain adaptation. And the way that we approach it is to is to take a multitask learning approach where we're learning with two different losses. One is our multiview representation loss, and the other is our recognizer loss on the target domain. So we're jointly learning a recognizer for a standard acoustic domain and a multiview representation using our acoustic articulatory data set. And then we again look at phonetic recognition, and we look at error rates. So now we have several sets of error rates depending on what domain we're testing on. So we're always learning our representation using the X-ray microbeam data set, but then we might be using it on new speakers from that same data set, on a standard data set called TIMIT, or on another standard data set, the Wall Street Journal data set. So Wall Street Journal is just read dictated sentences from the Wall Street Journal, whereas TIMIT is synthetically crafted set of phonetically rich sentences. Yes? So in this case, we use an end-to-end neural model based on connectionist temporal classification. Okay. So this is a pretty standard baseline. And so this is our baseline in light blue, and then the red bars are what happens if we just try to learn the representation in an unsupervised way and use it on the new data set. And that does not work very well across domains. However, if we learn jointly with the recognizer, which are these purple bars, we do much better. I think I'll skip the green bar for lack of time for now. But I can go back to it if there are questions later. So the conclusion from this section is basically we can learn features on some very, very special multiview data set, and then use that data set jointly to improve a recognizer on some standard data set. Okay. All right, so an NLP task. So we thought we should be able to use similar techniques to improve text representations. And what I'll show here is one example of a very, very simple experiment where we just tried to learn word embeddings using two languages as the views. Okay. And it turned out that after we started doing this, we were not the first to do this, but we were the first to use these particular techniques. So I'll show you a set of techniques that's been used for this task. So has everybody seen word embeddings? Okay, good. So word embeddings are just vector representations of words. They should represent the semantic content of a word. And the idea here is maybe if we have data from two languages that's aligned, we might be able to align their representations in the learned embedding space so as to improve the word embeddings. Okay, so why might we be able to do that? So different languages will naturally give us different views of some concept. So if we think about some words that are translationally equivalent, like a word in English and a word in German, maybe they can help us to disambiguate things that are naturally ambiguous in one of the languages or the other. So one phenomenon that's often seen in monolingual embeddings is that they will sometimes conflate antonyms. Antonyms will tend to have similar embeddings, whereas if we know that each of them translates to a different word, perhaps that will help us to disambiguate the two. Okay. And like I said, this idea had been used before by Farooqi and Dyer. And so we ended up using exactly their procedure, which is we start with some off-the-shelf word embeddings, maybe word-to-vec, that are learned independently for each language. We take a data set of parallel sentences, extract aligned word pairs. So this is a list of word pairs, And then we do CCA or some other type of multi-view representation learning on that set of pairs to map them to some shared space and see if those mapped embeddings do better than the original ones. And so jumping straight to results, we looked at how well our embeddings correlate with humans on similarity judgments. We looked at a couple of different tasks. This is a bigram similarity task. At this point, this is a pretty old task, but it's just to give you a sense of how these different methods compare. So let's mostly look at this average column, which is averaging over a number of subtasks. So we take the original embeddings, look at their cosine similarities, and then look at the Spearman's correlation between those similarities and human judgments of similarities. And so these are Spearman's correlations, so between 0 and 100, scaled to be between 0 and 100. This is the baseline, just using monolingual word embeddings. These are CCA embeddings, and then a variety of other multi-view learning techniques. The best ones tend to be the deep CCA-based ones, not always, but they tend to be a little bit better than linear CCA. One thing that I find interesting is that for text tasks, the difference between linear and nonlinear methods doesn't tend to be as large as it is for speech tasks. So I think that's an interesting thing that we still need to figure out where it's coming from. Yes?
The original embeddings, how did you produce them? How did theirs
The original embeddings were some standard off-the-shelf embedding at the time. Yeah. Yeah. And so we're either learning linear projections with CCA or we're learning nonlinear projections with something like deep CCA. Okay. Other applications. We've also applied these same techniques to image tagging, where the two views are images and their textual tags, and to image digit classification. So this is just the MNIST, the Multiview MNIST task. And typically we see that the CCA-based losses, the deep CCA-based losses, tend to do quite well. Sometimes contrastive losses also work quite well, but again, it depends on the task. So on digit classification, contrastive loss worked much worse than it did on image tagging. And we have some ideas about why, but we're still sort of figuring that out. The landscape of multi-view learning techniques, I think, is still a little bit wide open. Okay. Even more applications. So these are applications that have been studied by others that I will not go into in great detail, but just to sort of give you a sense of the wide variety of applications. CCA has been used to learn word embeddings, where the views are just the past and the future context of a word, or the word itself and its context. It's also been used to learn PCFGs, probabilistic context-free grammars. Hidden Markov models. They've been used to localize sound sources in videos, as well as decoding brain signals by using a stimulus and its neural response as different views. Okay, so to summarize, hopefully you're convinced that it's often possible to learn better representations if you have a multi-view data set to learn from. CCA tends to be a good baseline method. But there are other methods like contrastive loss, which are often good and sometimes better. And nonlinear extensions can be a lot better depending on the task. The key step is defining the views and finding a multi-view data set that contains the information that we're looking for. There's been applications in a wide variety of tasks. If you find this interesting, try it at home. We have some code available, and others do as well. Some of it, I apologize, is in MATLAB. Some of us still speak MATLAB. But there's also Python implementations by others. But I can't vouch for them. OK, thank you. Yes?
I just have a question. So if we have the data set of multiview, but the noises are somehow dependent, like
So in principle, they can be arbitrarily bad, right? If the noise is perfectly correlated, then CCA will just find that noise, right?
Basically, they are saying that like these methods can be applied only for any context.
So I'm not quite saying that. So in practice, obviously, we apply these methods to situations with correlated noise simply because it's very, very rare to get perfectly uncorrelated noise. So we deal with that correlated noise in various ways. We often have some supervision. I've mostly presented these techniques as unsupervised techniques where we just have the two views and nothing else. But very often we do have labels. And so we can use the labels as well as the multi-view data for some additional information. And so hopefully between the labels and the other view, you can tell which directions were the noise and which ones weren't. Yes? Can you say that one more time?
Can we understand or interpret if CCA goes? Can we understand what original data from Y or X will be in repeated presentation? If we use CCA classic, we can see what vectors is shared.
So separating between the shared and the private dimensions. So the best technique for that question is by far variational CCA because you can just learn explicitly shared versus private dimensions. In the other techniques, you'd kind of have to do some learning after the fact to sort out what was the common and what was the private. In principle, if you're just learning, say, CCA, you really should only be getting common information, right? But in practice, you might end up with some additional dimensions that are private.
Hi, I was just wondering how does multimodality compare to the multi-view framework? Is it just a subset of it? Because this is the first time that I hear about multi-view, and it's very cool. But is multimodality intrinsically different from multi-view learning, or is it just the case that in multi-view learning you're not always using different modes?
So typically when people say multimodal, they're referring to the case where you have multiple modalities at test time. So like say you're doing audio-visual speech recognition, you can listen to the speaker as well as do a little bit of lip reading. When people talk about multi-view representation learning, they typically mean that we get these multiple views at training time, but then we're going to use it to learn two representations, one for each view. And then we might only have one of them at test time.
Okay, thank you.
So my question is, are there any experimental results? Assume we want to learn representations of speech, and if our data set is unbalanced, so for example we have many examples of some classes, but very few examples of other classes. Are there any results? So how well can we learn the representations using multi-view approach?
So you're asking, might this be able to help us specifically for cases with very imbalanced priors
Yes.
on the classes.
Yes.
So there's nothing explicitly helping with that particular situation. Was there any reason you thought that it might be particularly helpful?
I just wanted to know, maybe you did experiments on that? And
No,
what
sorry.
data did you use in learning speech representations? Which speech corpus did you use?
Yes, so for all of the speech experiments, we used the X-ray microbeam corpus for the multiview representation learning part. And then the recognizers were either on the same corpus, on new speakers from the same corpus, or on the TIMIT corpus, which has a few hours of training data, or on the Wall Street Journal corpus, which has a few tens of hours of training data.
Okay, thank you.
Yes?
I have a question, like the first slide of them all, when you're passing from the signal in time to the Fourier space of frequency versus time, by taking these small tranches of the signal and time to discrete frequency from there, aren't you going to lose a lot of the higher frequency, lower frequency signal?
You mean, can the fact that we're taking windows of the signal? What the windowing does is it will lose frequency resolution. It will not necessarily lose any particular range of frequencies, but it will limit the frequency resolution. And now, typically for tasks like speech recognition, we don't care too much about frequency resolution. We care about the big outlines of the spectral envelope. But for tasks where you really care about very fine details of the frequency harmonics, like for example, for voice morphing or something where you really need a good fidelity representation, then you need larger windows or something specific for those kinds of tasks. Yes?
How do you define the difference for speech recognition across the language? Are there any language that
So there are big differences across languages. I've only...
Can you please repeat the question?
Yes, I'll repeat the question. The question was, are there systematic differences between languages that affect how well speech recognition works on different languages? So, right, I've only focused on English here. There are differences between languages that will affect speech recognition. So one big factor is, for example, a tone language versus a non-tone language. Will make a big difference to what type of representation you want to use in a speech recognizer. So a tone language, you would need to represent pitch in some way, whereas a non-tone language like English, you would kind of want to get rid of pitch. But typically, you kind of want to think about that before you do anything else. Include that in your original big representation before you do any learning. But yes, that is a big consideration across languages. So there'll be tone languages among the European languages. I won't tell you which right now because I'll get it wrong. But other types of differences besides tone can exist. For example, the phoneme inventories could be larger or smaller, and so that might affect how much detail you need to maintain in the acoustic representation. You don't see those differences as sort of a first order effect in speech recognition research. But the tone versus non-tone language question is a big one.